The ground was still wet. The screaming had been going on for 6 hours. And then, around 8 o'clock on the evening of the 18th of June, 1815, something happened that no one in the French army had ever witnessed or believed possible. The Imperial Guard began to walk backward. Before that moment, Napoleon commanded 74,500 veteran soldiers, the finest army France had ever assembled. He outnumbered Wellington's force by several thousand men. He had beaten every combination of European powers thrown at him for 20 years. Wellington's own officers, the morning of that battle, privately gave him even odds of survival. Contemporary accounts on both sides document the disparity. One side fighting with the confidence of an unbroken 20-year record, the other clinging to a ridge and a promise from an ally who hadn't yet arrived. So what happened? Before 9 o'clock that Sunday evening, Napoleon's army had ceased to exist as a fighting force, destroyed not by a single brilliant maneuver, but by 4 simultaneous catastrophes that each, independently, should have been survivable. But here is what military historians have never fully resolved. Why did Napoleon wait? He had his army in position by dawn. His artillery was unlimbered. His veterans were ready. And yet the first French cannon shot of that day didn't fire until approximately 11:20 in the morning, nearly 6 hours after first light. The official explanation was mud. But the Prussians were marching through that same mud toward Napoleon's flank, with every hour that passed. Something happened that morning at his headquarters. A hesitation, a physical crisis, a logistical failure, or something that the records hint at but never fully explain. And 74,000 men paid the price for it in blood. 3 things will reframe everything you think you know about this battle. The battle was decided not by Napoleon's Guard or Wellington squares, but by 400 German riflemen defending a farmhouse whose ammunition wagon had been lost before the fighting even began. Wellington himself admitted, afterward, that he had made the error that nearly cost him everything. An admission almost unprecedented from the Iron Duke. And the peace that Waterloo purchased lasted 99 years, not a single major European war disturbing the continent until 1914. To understand why a man who had never lost a war hesitated for 6 fatal hours on the morning that decided everything, we need to go back to February 1815. And the moment Napoleon stepped off a ship with 1,000 men and an idea that horrified every government in Europe. On the 26th of February, 1815, a man the Congress of Vienna had just declared an international outlaw boarded a ship in the Mediterranean with approximately 1,000 soldiers from his personal guard and sailed for France. No army intercepted him. No fleet stopped him. The royalist troops sent to arrest him defected to his banner instead. And on the 20th of March, less than 4 weeks after departing his island exile on Elba, Napoleon Bonaparte walked back into Paris, into the Tuileries Palace that King Louis XVIII had fled the night before. Without firing a single shot, the Congress of Vienna had been deliberating for months, redrawing the borders of a post-Napoleonic Europe with the elaborate diplomatic choreography that its critics called a dancing congress of lavish social events, rather than serious governance. News of Napoleon's escape reached Vienna on the 7th of March. On the 13th, 7 days before Napoleon reached Paris, the assembled powers issued a joint declaration branding him a criminal and a disturber of the world's peace. On the 25th of March, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formally bound themselves into the 7th Coalition, each pledging to field 150,000 men until Napoleon was permanently removed from power. The language was unambiguous. This was not negotiation. It was extermination of a political threat. The mathematical reality Napoleon faced was staggering. The coalition could mobilize approximately 850,000 soldiers converging on France from 4 directions. Napoleon could field perhaps 250,000 men total, and that figure included every soldier in every garrison across France. Men who could not all be stripped from their posts without leaving the country defenseless. He could not conscript either. Louis XVIII had abolished conscription during his restoration, meaning Napoleon was entirely dependent on veterans, volunteers, and soldiers recalled from leave, for his army would be experienced. It would not be enormous. Given this arithmetic, defensive warfare was not a strategy. It was suicide by installment. The coalition planned to invade France by the 1st of July. Napoleon's operational doctrine, the doctrine that had made him the most dangerous commander in the world, dictated a preemptive strike. He would cross the frontier into the Netherlands before that date, drive a wedge between the Anglo-Allied army under Wellington and the Prussian army under Blücher, and defeat them separately before Austrian and Russian forces could arrive from the east. A swift, decisive victory against the 2 nearest coalition armies might shatter political will in London and Berlin, forcing peace before the full weight of 850,000 soldiers could be brought to bear. It was, as strategic plans go, entirely rational. Napoleon had done variations of this operational sequence a dozen times. The question was whether Wellington and Blücher would cooperate with it. What Napoleon could not fully account for was the specific nature of the 2 men he was moving against. Blücher, the Prussian field marshal, was 72 years old, famously pugnacious, and had made a promise at a moment of personal near catastrophe that he considered binding regardless of circumstances. Wellington, the British commander, had spent 7 years in the Iberian Peninsula learning exactly how to fight the French, and had never, in a career stretching from India to Portugal to Spain, lost a battle. Between them, these 2 men would make Napoleon's plan not merely difficult, but impossible. He just didn't know it yet. The race to Belgium had begun. Napoleon had 6 weeks. He intended to use every day of them. Picture Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, in March 1815. A man who had just received news, at the Congress of Vienna, that the most dangerous soldier in the world had escaped his island prison. He said his goodbyes with characteristic brevity, including to Tsar Alexander, who reportedly rested a paternal hand on Wellington's shoulder and told him, "It is for you to save the world again," and began making preparations to leave for the Netherlands. He had been here before, not this exact situation, but this exact type of problem. An enemy with superior resources, allies of questionable reliability, and a battlefield that had to be chosen and prepared before the fighting began. Wellington was born in Dublin on the 1st of May, in 1769, into a Protestant Anglo-Irish family. He was commissioned as an ensign in the British Army in 1787, serving first in Ireland as aide-de-camp to successive Lord's Lieutenant before beginning the campaigns in India that would define his early career. Against the Mysoreans and the Marathas, Wellesley learned things that most European generals never had occasion to practice. How to manage impossible supply lines, how to handle politically delicate alliances, how to navigate situations where his orders were theoretically subordinate to those of men less competent than himself. Military historian Richard Holmes noted that these Indian campaigns had a formative influence on his personality and tactics that proved vital to everything that followed. The Peninsular War, running from 1808 to 1814, completed his education in ways India could not. Against the best of Napoleon's marshals, across 6 years of fighting in Portugal, Spain, and eventually southern France, Wellington won every major engagement he commanded. He did this not through the audacious operational sweeps that made Napoleon famous, but through something less celebrated and more reliable: preparation, terrain, supply, and a cold patience that made his army survive when everything else was failing around them. His signature tactic, refined campaign by campaign, was the reverse slope defense, positioning his infantry on the sheltered side of a ridge, invisible from the enemy, protected from flat trajectory artillery, ready to appear at the crest only when the moment was precisely right. What Wellington was not, Napoleon knew he was not, was Napoleon's strategic equal. He said so privately, in terms more candid than most generals allow themselves. He acknowledged that the French emperor possessed a quality of audacity he did not share. What he had, instead, was something that audacity often destroys: a comprehensive grasp of his own limitations and those of his army. The army Wellington found waiting for him in the Netherlands was, by his own assessment, problematic. It was a multinational amalgamation of British regulars, Dutch-Belgian conscripts, Hanoverians, Brunswickers, and Nassau troops, some of whom had been fighting for Napoleon barely a year earlier, and whose loyalty to any particular coalition was, at minimum, recently established. Wellington was compelled by political necessity to retain Prince William of Orange in nominal command of First Corps despite the young man's limited experience, and was acutely short of heavy cavalry, fielding only 7 British and 3 Dutch heavy cavalry regiments for an army of over 68,000 men. He set about integrating this force with the same methodical energy he had applied to every previous command, mixing veteran and raw units within the same formations, ensuring every soldier was paid and supplied, and personally inspecting the terrain over which he might eventually have to fight. One day, walking in a Brussels park with the politician Thomas Creevey, Wellington was asked whether he thought he could defeat Napoleon. His answer was characteristic: "By God, and I think Blücher and myself can do the thing." He pointed to a British soldier sightseeing nearby and added that it would depend on having enough of that particular article. No strategic brilliance in Napoleon's mold. No operational sweeps designed to encircle and annihilate in a single campaign. Just preparation, terrain, supply, and the kind of cold patience that makes armies survive when everything else fails. Across the valley from wherever Wellington would eventually stand, another commander was assembling a force whose veterans had followed him from Egypt to Moscow. That commander had never lost a war. Wellington had never lost a battle. One of those records was about to end. Napoleon Bonaparte in June 1815 was 45 years old, had fought more than 60 major engagements, and had not lost a war in his 20 years of command. What he had lost, twice, was political legitimacy, and this army existed to win it back. He understood with the clarity of a man who had rebuilt France's military from revolutionary chaos to the finest instrument of war in the world, that he had perhaps 6 weeks before coalition numbers made any campaign pointless. He used those weeks with the controlled urgency of someone who has done this before. The Army of the North that Napoleon assembled between March and June of 1815 numbered approximately 74,500 men, 54,014 infantry, 15,830 cavalry, and 8,775 artillerymen and engineers, operating 254 guns. And these figures come from the Service Historique de l'Armée de Terre Archive, the official French military records. This was not a conscript force. Napoleon had not called up the class of 1815 in time for this campaign. The men who crossed into Belgium in June were veterans, soldiers who had fought from the Nile to the Niemen, and who carried, as their professional credential, the accumulated experience of a generation of European warfare. The army was structured into 6 formations: the 1st Corps, under General Jean-Baptiste Drouet d'Erlon, and the 2nd Corps, under General Honoré Charles Reille, would form the primary assault elements. The 6th Corps, under General Georges Mouton, served as Napoleon's operational reserve. The 2 cavalry corps and the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite reserve and final weapon, completed the order of battle. Exercising tactical field command during the battle itself would be Marshal Michel Ney, whom Napoleon had once called the bravest of the brave. But the army carried a structural weakness that rapid mobilization had made unavoidable. Because officers had presented themselves for duty as they arrived, rather than being assigned to pre-existing units, brigades and divisions were led by commanders unfamiliar to their men and to each other. There were no established relationships, no shared tactical shorthand, no accumulated institutional trust. In a complex battle requiring multiple units to coordinate without direct orders from the top, this would prove lethal. Wellington's army had its own coordination problems, but at least its veterans had fought together before. Several of Napoleon's formations were meeting their commanders for the first time. The second structural problem was the detachment of Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy with approximately 33,000 men, nearly a third of the total force, to pursue the Prussian army after the preliminary battle at Ligny. This was operationally necessary. Leaving 60,000 Prussians free to march wherever Blücher chose would have been strategic suicide. But it meant Napoleon would fight at Waterloo with roughly 41,000 men directly engaged, while Grouchy was somewhere to the east, doing something. The question of exactly what Grouchy was supposed to do, and why he didn't do it, would generate 2 centuries of debate. The Imperial Guard remained Napoleon's trump card, intact and uncommitted, comprising 7 battalions of foot grenadiers, 7 battalions of foot chasseurs, and 8 battalions of young guard. These were the men whose advance had ended battles across Europe. Their very appearance on a battlefield changed the psychological calculus for both armies. They were the argument Napoleon intended to make when everything else had established the conditions for their decisive intervention. 20 years. More than 60 battles. No lost wars. Wellington had never lost a battle either. Between these 2 records, on 18 June 1815, something had to give. 2 days before Waterloo, on Friday the 16th of June 1815, Napoleon fought the last battle he ever won. It wasn't Waterloo. It was at a small village called Ligny, roughly 13 kilometers north of Namur, where his Army of the North struck Blücher's Prussian forces and drove them from the field. The victory was genuine. The Prussians lost over 20,000 men and retreated north toward Wavre. French casualties were approximately half that. By the tactical mathematics of Napoleonic warfare, Ligny should have been decisive. It was not for a reason that illuminates everything about how the Waterloo campaign unraveled for the French. An entire French corps, d'Erlon's 1st Corps, approximately 20,000 of Napoleon's finest infantry, spent the afternoon of the 16th of June marching back and forth between Ligny and the nearby crossroads battle at Quatre Bras without attacking either position. The corps arrived in view of Ligny as the battle was reaching its climax, began moving to intervene, and received confused and contradictory orders from multiple commanders, and ultimately withdrew without striking a blow. Had d'Erlon's corps struck Blücher's flank at Ligny, the Prussian defeat would have been not merely significant, but potentially catastrophic. The kind of comprehensive destruction that prevents an army from recovering in time to march 12 kilometers and appear on an enemy's flank 2 days later. Instead, Blücher's army was beaten, but not broken. Field Marshal Blücher himself had a closer encounter with catastrophe than his troops. At the end of the fighting, the 72-year-old commander was knocked from his horse during a cavalry charge, and was nearly trampled by horsemen of both sides, passing over him in the confusion. His aide, von Nostitz, lay on top of him to protect him until the immediate danger passed. Blücher recovered, resumed command, and did something that would ultimately cost Napoleon the campaign. He made a promise to Wellington that he intended to keep. Simultaneously, at the crossroads of Quatre Bras, Wellington had fought off a separate French assault under Ney. The result was a draw. The British held the crossroads, inflicted and absorbed significant casualties, but found their position untenable once the Prussian defeat at Ligny exposed their flank. Wellington was compelled to retreat northward toward a ridge he had already identified and mentally selected. He fell back in good order through the night of the 16th and the rain-soaked 17th of June, the French main force under Napoleon pursuing. Wellington had already sent word to Blücher. If Blücher could promise to bring even one Prussian corps to his support, Wellington would accept battle at a position south of Waterloo. Without that support, he would have no choice but to continue retreating toward Brussels. The guarantee Blücher sent back shaped everything that followed. Despite the beating at Ligny, despite his bruised ribs, despite the exhaustion of an army that had just lost 20,000 men, the Prussian field marshal promised to march. Not one corps, but the entire available army would come to Wellington's assistance. It was a promise from a man who could have reasonably argued that his forces needed time to recover, that the risk of another engagement so quickly after a major defeat was imprudent, that prudence dictated waiting. Blücher made no such argument. The Prussians would march. Wellington received this assurance, selected his position on the Mont Saint-Jean escarpment, and decided to stand and fight. The Battle of Waterloo was made possible by the stubbornness of one 72-year-old man, keeping his word. Dawn on the 18th of June, 1815, broke over ground that was not beautiful. The fields south of the village of Waterloo were saturated from the previous night's storms, the roads churned to black mud by the passage of armies retreating and pursuing across the same ground. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, Wellington's chosen position, looked from the French side almost empty. That appearance was not accidental. It was the point. Wellington's reverse slope defense, the signature tactic he had refined across 7 years in the Iberian Peninsula, worked by denying the enemy information. He positioned the bulk of his infantry on the northern sheltered face of the ridge, invisible from the French side, protected from the flat horizontal trajectory of Napoleonic artillery. French gunners, unable to see their targets and unable to adjust their fire based on observed results, would be firing essentially blind. The infantry waiting on that reverse slope would not know this unless they were told. What they would feel was the absence of the devastating bombardment that should have preceded any French assault. The defensive position was further strengthened by 3 fortified agricultural complexes positioned forward of the main ridge line, each serving as an anchor point that any French assault would have to account for. On the extreme right of Wellington's position stood the Château d'Hougoumont, a large walled manorial compound comprising a chateau, stables, kitchen garden, formal garden, orchard, and surrounding woodland, positioned approximately 500 yards in front of Wellington's right flank. Wellington had reinforced it with foot guards from the British Army alongside Nassau and Hanoverian troops. A sunken lane connecting the compound to the Allied rear allowed for resupply under cover throughout the battle. Any French assault on Wellington's right center would be subjected to enfilading fire from Hougoumant's garrison. Wellington rode to inspect it personally before the battle, emphasizing its importance to the commander, Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonnell of the Coldstream Guards, in terms that left no ambiguity. Defend the post to the last extremity. Then, when the Prussian liaison officer General Muffling expressed doubt that such an exposed position could really be held with so few men, Wellington cut off the discussion. "Ah," he said, But you do not know MacDonald. In the center of the battlefield, directly adjacent to the main Brussels road and approximately 100 yards in front of Wellington's central position, stood the farmhouse complex of La Haye Sainte. Wellington assigned its defense to Major Georg Baring and the 2nd Light Battalion of the King's German Legion. Approximately 400 riflemen, armed not with the standard British smoothbore musket, but with the Baker rifle, a weapon of superior range and accuracy. La Haye Sainte sat at the intersection that gave whoever controlled it command of the road connecting Brussels to the French position. Napoleon would later say it had cost him the battle. Wellington would later admit he had failed to protect it properly. At dawn on the 18th, neither man yet understood the farmhouse's centrality. The terrain between the ridges channeled French attacks in ways that multiplied Wellington's advantages. The valley was approximately 1.5 kilometers across at its widest point, with the battlefield itself spanning roughly 5.5 kilometers. The farms constrained deployment. A French force that outnumbered Wellington's by several thousand men could not bring all its strength to bear simultaneously. The mathematics of the 2-to-1 numerical advantage would never fully materialize, which was, in the end, the point of selecting this particular hill. Here is what every account of the 18th of June 1815 agrees on. Napoleon did not fire his first cannon shot until approximately 11:20 in the morning, on a summer day when first light had come before 5 o'clock. Here is what 2 centuries of historical argument have failed to resolve. Why? The official explanation, the one Napoleon himself offered, and that historians have repeated ever since, was mud. The torrential storms of the night before had saturated the fields between the ridges. Napoleon's heavy 12-pounder artillery pieces, the backbone of his grand battery, required firm ground to move and deploy effectively. Wet ground also degraded the effectiveness of round shot. Standard Napoleonic artillery doctrine relied on iron balls ricocheting across hard earth, tearing through formations with each successive bounce. On the waterlogged fields of Mont Saint-Jean, those same cannonballs would bury themselves on first impact. Waiting for the ground to dry was, on its face, an unreasonable operational decision. Paul Dawson, in his historical analysis of the Waterloo campaign, has argued that the mud explanation was something closer to a useful narrative covering a more embarrassing reality. The French army was not ready to attack at dawn because it had not fully concentrated its forces from the previous day's march. The logistical capacity to assemble 70,000 men rapidly on a saturated road network may simply have been beyond what the Army of the North could achieve after the exertions of the 16th and 17th of June. This explanation is less romantic than mud and more difficult to defend the emperor's reputation, which may account for why it was never prominently featured in French accounts of the campaign. A third explanation hovers at the edge of historical respectability. Napoleon was not well that morning. His officers recorded that he fell back asleep at his breakfast table and had to be roused. Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, initially described the emperor as suffering from a little weakness of the bladder during the campaign, then later confessed to the historian Monsieur Thiers that he had been embarrassed to say at the time that Napoleon's primary complaint was hemorrhoids. The medical evidence for Napoleon's chronic ailments, gastrointestinal disorders, urological problems, probable hemorrhoidal inflammation, is genuine and documented. Andrew Roberts, who examined this question carefully in his work on Napoleon and Wellington, concludes firmly that these medical conditions do not explain the defeat. Napoleon was in the saddle by 8 o'clock. The health complaints were real. Their role as a decisive cause is, Roberts argues, a construction employed largely to preserve the myth that Napoleon could not have been beaten by a healthy Napoleon. The honest answer is that we don't know. The 3 explanations, mud, logistics, health are not mutually exclusive, and the historical record does not allow us to assign precise weights to each. What the record does show, with uncomfortable clarity, is the consequence. Every hour Napoleon spent waiting on the morning of the 18th was an hour the Prussian Fourth Corps under Friedrich von Bülow used to march 13 kilometers from Wavre. Bülow's corps had not fought at Ligny. They were fresh, at full strength, and moving toward Napoleon's right flank. By the time the French Grand Battery finally opened fire, the Prussian vanguard was already visible on the horizon to the east. The window for winning the battle before the Prussian arrival narrowed from hours to minutes. That is what 6 hours of waiting cost. Napoleon's plan for Hougoumont was elegant and limited. Launch a heavy attack on Wellington's right flank, not to capture the farmhouse, but to threaten it convincingly enough that Wellington would drain reserves from his center to protect it. 30 minutes, perhaps an hour, then pull back and watch Wellington discover that he had weakened the position where the real blow was coming. It was the correct strategic instinct. Jerome Bonaparte made it into something else entirely. The assault on Hougoumont began at approximately 11:30 in the morning, led by divisions of Reilly's Second Corps under generals including Prince Jérôme himself and General Pierre-François Baudouin. The attacking French infantry entered the woods south of the chateau compound and immediately encountered the kind of fighting that woodland terrain produces. Close, confused, brutal, impossible to observe from a distance or to coordinate with any precision. The French gained control of the woods, but could not force the walls of the compound itself. They came back. They came back again. And each time they came back with more men. What Napoleon intended as a 30-minute feint, Jerome turned into a consuming obsession. Rather than maintaining the limited pressure that served the strategic purpose, the French committed more and more of Reilly's corps to actually taking the farmhouse, to breaking through walls that MacDonald's guards had prepared for exactly this kind of assault. The attrition that resulted was not symmetrical. The defending garrison, resupplied via the covered sunken lane at the rear, was fighting from fixed positions behind solid walls against attackers crossing open ground. Then came the moment that Wellington would later call the most important single action in the battle. A large French officer, identified in historical literature as Legros, though modern historiography has questioned whether this was his actual name, used a heavy axe to smash through the north gate of the compound, breaking into the inner courtyard. Approximately 30 French soldiers pushed through the breach behind him. And according to Wellington's own Supplementary Dispatches, Volume 11, what followed was immediate and decisive. MacDonald and Corporal James Graham fought through the melee to the gate, forced it closed against continuing French pressure from outside, and barred it. Every French soldier who had entered the courtyard was killed in the subsequent fighting. Everyone except a young drummer boy. Some years after the battle, a Reverend John Norcross sought to give a financial bequest to the bravest man at Waterloo, and wrote to Wellington asking him to nominate someone. Wellington's response went directly to this moment. The success of the Battle of Waterloo turned on the closing of the gates at Hougoumont, he wrote. The gates were closed in the most courageous manner at the very nick of time by the efforts of Sir J. Thus MacDonald. MacDonald himself, when informed of the honor, immediately insisted on sharing it with Corporal Graham, stating that he could not claim all the credit, since Graham had rushed forward and shut the gate together with him. Wellington sent a note during the battle, written in pencil on a piece of goat skin. The note survives, instructing MacDonald that even as the buildings burned from French howitzer fire, the garrison must hold every part of the compound the flames had not yet reached. The calm of the instruction, given to men fighting house to house amid burning buildings while being attacked from multiple directions, is difficult to adequately convey. The compound was never captured. 7 separate French attacks were repulsed throughout the day. Reille's entire Second Corps, the force Napoleon had intended to use as his operational punch, was absorbed into a grinding attrition battle against a farmhouse that refused to fall. Napoleon had designed Hougoumont as a trap for Wellington's reserves. It became a trap for his own. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with the fighting at Hougoumont already consuming far more of Reille's corps than Napoleon had planned, the French Grand Battery, approximately 80 guns massed on a slight ridge south of La Haye Sainte, opened a sustained bombardment against Wellington's center. By every principle of Napoleonic warfare, what followed should have been devastating. The Grand Battery represented the concentrated firepower of the finest artillery in Europe, directed against a stationary defensive position at manageable range. Wellington had hidden most of his infantry on the reverse slope of the ridge. The French were, for the most part, firing at grass. There was one exception. The Dutch-Belgian brigade, under Major General Baron von Bylandt, had been positioned forward on the slope, exposed to direct fire for reasons that remain disputed among historians. Whatever the reason, Bylandt's brigade, including the 7th and 27th Battalions, bore the full weight of the bombardment that the reverse slope was designed to deflect. The casualties inflicted on Bylandt's men during the 1.5-hour bombardment were severe. When d'Erlon's infantry assault followed, Bylandt's already attrited brigade would be the first Allied formation to give way. Marshal Ney launched the infantry of Drouet d'Erlon's First Corps, approximately 19,000 men, directly at the Allied center. For reasons that military historians have debated ever since, d'Erlon's divisions deployed in an unusual and operationally cumbersome formation. Rather than the standard battalion columns, they advanced in massive, dense blocks of deployed battalions stacked closely behind one another. Bernard Cornwell, in his history of the Waterloo campaign, described the formation as resembling a brick advancing sideways. It provided an enormous frontage that made the columns nearly impossible to maneuver once in motion. And critically, it prevented the French infantry from deploying into firing lines to return musketry effectively. The men in the rear ranks could not fire because the men in front of them were in the way. Whether this formation was Napoleon's direct order or d'Erlon's improvisation remains a genuinely contested question. What is not contested is the result. As the French columns crested the ridge and struck the Allied line, the density that was supposed to provide momentum instead made them ideal targets for British musketry. Lieutenant General Sir Thomas Picton ordered his 5th Division to stand, fire a close-range volley into the French masses, and charge. The volley, delivered into columns so dense that every ball found a target, staggered the leading French elements. During this action, and the detail comes from multiple contemporary accounts, General Picton was shot through the head and killed. He had been concealing a wound received 2 days earlier at Quatre Bras, had refused to be evacuated, and was fighting without his uniform coat. He died leading his men forward. In the fighting that followed, 2 Imperial Eagles were captured. The Eagle of the French 45th Line Regiment, taken by Sergeant Charles Ewart of the Royal Scots Greys after a savage individual fight that Ewart's own account describes. And the Eagle of the 105th Regiment, whose bearer was killed by Captain Alexander Kennedy Clark. Corporal Francis Stiles recovered it from the ground. The 45th Eagle is still held by the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. The 105th Eagle is on display at the National Army Museum in London. d'Erlon's assault had stalled on the ridge. Bylandt's brigade had broken. Picton was dead. And at that moment, the Earl of Uxbridge looked at 19,000 men in dense, with disorganized masses on the Allied position, and made the decision every cavalry commander dreams of finding. The Earl of Uxbridge, Wellington's cavalry commander, had been watching d'Erlon's stalled columns from his position on the ridge. What he saw was the tactical opportunity that comes once in a battle, if it comes at all. Dense masses of infantry, partially disorganized by musketry, caught in the open with no cavalry support immediately available. He granted himself what he later described as carte blanche and launched the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade, the finest heavy cavalry Britain possessed, over the ridge and into the valley. The charge was, in its initial phase, as close to perfect as heavy cavalry ever achieves. The psychological and physical shock of armored horsemen at full gallop, striking disorganized infantry masses, shattered d'Erlon's First Corps. The French broke and fled. Thousands of casualties were inflicted. 2 eagles were captured in the chaos. For approximately 10 minutes, the Union Brigade's charge was one of the most effective cavalry actions of the Napoleonic Wars. Then, it stopped being a cavalry action and became a catastrophe. The British horsemen, intoxicated by the violence of their success, ignored the trumpet calls to halt and reform. They galloped down through the valley, up the slope toward the French position, and continued beyond any defensible objective. Historical accounts, including various British cavalry officers' memoirs, place some riders as far as the first French artillery positions. Modern analysis of the engagement suggests they more likely reached d'Erlon's divisional artillery rather than the main Grand Battery. The distance and the condition of their horses by that point making the latter improbable. What is certain is that they arrived at whatever point they did reach on blown horses, having lost formation, with no coherent command structure, exposed to counterattack from cavalry that was fresh. French lancers and cuirassiers countercharged. The Union Brigade, which minutes earlier had been destroying an entire French corps, was now fighting for its existence against horsemen who were rested and organized. The casualties the British suffered in this countercharge were catastrophic. Regiments that had charged as coherent formations struggled back across the valley in fragments. Major General Sir William Ponsonby, commander of the Union Brigade, was killed. The specifics of how he died have been debated by historians. A romanticized account describes him being unhorsed when his horse became mired, then speared by lancers. Modern scholarship is more cautious about the precise circumstances, confirming his death while declining to specify the exact manner. What is confirmed is that he died, and that his death, combined with the destruction of the brigade's cohesion, robbed Wellington of his heavy cavalry reserve for the remaining 6 or more hours of battle. Wellington was not sympathetic when he reflected on it afterward. The British cavalry never know when to stop charging, he complained. The charge had won the morning engagement by destroying d'Erlon's assault. The overextension had destroyed the instrument that achieved it. Both things were true simultaneously. For the rest of the day, Wellington would fight without the capacity to launch a decisive, heavy cavalry counterstroke. And Marshal Ney was about to test that limitation severely. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Marshal Ney observed movement in Wellington's center. Allied soldiers were repositioning, casualties being carried backward, formations reorganizing out of artillery range. The natural administrative traffic of an army that has absorbed several hours of punishment. Ney interpreted what he saw as the beginning of a general retreat. He ordered the cavalry. What began as a commitment of approximately 5,000 cuirassiers, heavy armored cavalry in steel breastplates and backplates, riding massive horses bred for weight and impact, escalated across successive charges into waves of 9,000 to 10,000 French horsemen attacking the Allied ridge. This was, by any doctrine, an assault of unsupported cavalry against formed infantry, a tactical category that military theory held to be essentially self-defeating. Wellington ordered his infantry into squares. The infantry square was the standard defensive formation against cavalry, and understanding why it worked requires picturing it clearly. A dense hollow box, 3 or 4 ranks deep on each side, with the front rank kneeling and grounding the butts of their muskets, angling their bayonets outward at the chest height of an approaching horse. The ranks behind firing volleys over their heads. Horses, operating on instinct rather than ideology, or will not charge directly into a solid wall of steel and men. What the French cavalry was forced to do, charge after charge, was wash around the sides of these formations, discharging carbines and pistols at point-blank range, slashing at infantrymen through the gaps, unable to break through a formation that held its nerve. Inside the squares, conditions were appalling. Ensign Gronow of the Foot Guards left a contemporary account of the experience. Nearly suffocated by smoke and the smell of burnt cartridges, deafened by the roar of guns, forced to stand still as horses and riders crashed around them and artillery fire struck the densely packed formations. Several severely depleted regiments had to merge with neighboring units just to maintain the four-sided integrity that made the square effective. The men holding those formations were not performing an abstract military exercise. They were standing in place while people tried to kill them because they understood that the moment the formation broke, everyone inside it would die. The traditional historical account presents Ney's cavalry charges as a straightforward tactical blunder. Cavalry without infantry support cannot break formed squares, and Ney sent his horsemen in without coordinating an infantry assault to force the squares to break apart and expose themselves. Modern historical analysis, examining French casualty rolls and contemporary accounts, has complicated this picture, and the charges were accompanied by substantial forward deployments of French horse artillery that fired point-blank canister into the Allied squares. Anti-personnel fire at close range that was causing genuine devastation. The combined arms reality of the cavalry charges was more dangerous than the simplified, pure blunder narrative suggests. The squares held regardless, but they held at real cost. The fundamental result is unambiguous across all sources. Not a single intact British or Allied infantry square was broken by cavalry that afternoon. Victor Hugo, in Les Miserables, claimed that 7 squares were broken and 60 guns spiked. Both figures are entirely fabricated. No British guns were permanently captured during the charges, and no intact square was broken. The Alliance held the ridge. The charges exhausted themselves, and while Ney's horsemen had been dying against immovable squares for 2.5 hours, the farmhouse in the center of the valley had been dying of something quieter. While the cavalry charges played out on the ridge above, a different kind of battle had been grinding through the afternoon in the valley below. It lacked the spectacle of 10,000 horses and the visual drama of Napoleon's Guard. It was 400 men in a farmhouse, running out of bullets. And it was, in retrospect, the hinge on which the entire battle turned. Major Georg Baring's 2nd Light Battalion of the King's German Legion had occupied La Haye Sainte the evening before the battle, arriving at 7:30 in the rain to begin hastily fortifying the compound. The historian Alessandro Barbero, whose work on Waterloo draws on French, British, Prussian, and German sources, characterizes the King's German Legion as having achieved a level of professionalism considered equal in every way to the best British units. These were experienced Peninsula veterans, and Baring was an experienced Peninsula commander. Each man carried 60 rounds of ammunition for his Baker rifle. There was no pre-positioned reserve supply inside the farmhouse. The ammunition wagon that should have followed the battalion had been overturned on the Brussels road before the fighting began. Its whereabouts uncertain and its contents unavailable. The Baker rifle created the specific crisis. It was a superior weapon to the standard British smoothbore musket in both range and accuracy, but it used different ammunition. When Baring began sending desperate messages to the rear requesting resupply, where there was no pool of Baker rifle cartridges in the general supply train from which his men could be served. The Army's ammunition logistics had not been organized to account for this. Baring sent his requests at least 3 times. Nothing came. The fighting at Haye Sainte had been continuous since approximately 1 o'clock. The garrison repulsed multiple assaults, the Baker rifles' accuracy making French attacks across the open ground in front of the compound expensive. By late afternoon, the 60 rounds that each man had started with were approaching exhaustion. 3 to 4 rounds per man, on average, remained when the final French assault came. Led personally by Marshal Ney at approximately 6 o'clock, with a regiment of light infantry and engineer support. The gates, on one of which had been removed for firewood the night before by soldiers who hadn't anticipated needing it, were forced. The roof was burning from howitzer fire. Baring ordered the retreat through the farmhouse and into the rear garden, covering his men as they went. Of Baring's original 400 defenders, 42 were still fully operational at the battle's end. The others were dead, wounded, or captured. Wellington admitted after the battle, in an acknowledgement unusual for a commander whose professional identity was built on meticulous preparation, that it had been a catastrophic error not to have cut holes in the rear wall of the compound through which ammunition could have been passed. The most important tactical position on his battlefield had been left to fight with 60 rounds per man and no resupply mechanism. Then the fall of Haye Sainte at approximately 6 o'clock brought French artillery to within 300 yards of Wellington Center. The guns began firing canister. Tin canisters filled with musket balls that transformed each cannon into a massive shotgun at close range, directly into formations that had already spent 7 hours absorbing punishment. Wellington Center was, at that moment, genuinely close to breaking. Napoleon on St. Helena reportedly said that the resistance at Haye Sainte had cost him the battle. Wellington's army would have agreed with the assessment. From the opposite direction, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, while Ney's cavalry was still breaking against Wellington's squares above and Haye Sainte was still holding below, the vanguard of the Prussian 4th Corps under General Friedrich von Bülow emerged from the Bois de Paris wood on Napoleon's extreme right flank. They had marched from Wavre through the same mud that Napoleon had cited as his reason for delaying the battle's start by 6 hours. A fire in the town of Wavre had delayed their departure further. None of it had stopped them. Bülow's 4th Corps carried a specific significance that distinguished it from the other Prussian formations. It had not fought at Ligny 2 days earlier. It had taken no casualties, suffered no trauma, experienced no demoralization. It arrived at Waterloo at full strength, fresh, with its cohesion intact. Napoleon had received intelligence earlier in the day. His brother Jerome had reported it, based on information captured from a Belgian courier, that Prussian forces were moving toward his flank. Napoleon dismissed the report. He told Jerome that the Prussians needed at least 2 days to recover from their defeat at Ligny. He had been wrong about how long Blücher would need by approximately 44 hours. The Prussians began assaulting the village of Plancenoit, located directly in the French right rear, threatening Napoleon's sole line of retreat down the road toward Genappe and the French frontier. The fighting that developed in Plancenoit was of a different character than what was happening on the main battlefield. House-to-house combat in a confined village, close-range canister fire blasting down narrow streets, a bayonet fighting in doorways and gardens. Napoleon was forced to commit Lobau's 6th Corps to stabilize the flank. When that proved insufficient, elements of the young guard and eventually the old guard were fed into Plancenoit, units that Napoleon was simultaneously trying to preserve as his reserve for the decisive blow against Wellington. The strategic trap was now complete. Napoleon was fighting two simultaneous battles with one army. Every battalion he sent to Plancenoit was a battalion unavailable against Wellington. Every hour Blucher's men pressed on the right flank was an hour of attrition Napoleon could not afford. Wellington's position, though battered, was holding. The Prussian position was growing stronger as more corps arrived. Napoleon's position was growing weaker as his reserves divided between two directions, and at approximately 5:45 in the afternoon, Wellington was overheard to say, "Give me Knight or give me Blucher." The Prussians, marching through mud they had been told would stop them, were Blucher, and they were coming in force. Wellington had one card left, but Napoleon had one card as well, and it was the same card he had always played when everything else had failed to produce decision. The Imperial Guard had never been defeated in a direct assault. In 20 years of Napoleonic warfare, across every major engagement from the Italian campaigns to Austerlitz to Wagram, the Guard's advance had signaled one thing: the battle was concluding. When the Guard attacked, armies broke before them. This was not mythology constructed after the fact. It was the documented record of every engagement where they had been committed to offensive action. And every soldier on that field, French and Allied alike, knew it. Napoleon committed them at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, after the fall of La Haye Sainte had opened the gap in Wellington's center that the Guard was meant to exploit. 5 battalions of the Middle Guard, tall, robust veterans selected for size and proven courage, advanced up the Mont Saint-Jean ridge in echelon formations, supported by horse artillery positioned between their squares. The Wellington center, which had absorbed 12.5 hours of combat, was in its most precarious state of the entire battle. The units that had defended the ridge all day were depleted, reorganized, and in several places had merged regiments just to maintain coherent formations. Wellington's reserve cavalry was largely spent. La Haye Sainte, the central anchor that had channeled the battle for 6 hours, was now in French hands with French guns firing from it. The Guard struck and pierced the first Allied line. Several British and German units fell back in what contemporary accounts describe as frightful confusion. The Guard moved through the smoke into what its soldiers genuinely believed was a breaking enemy. The Allied center appeared to be giving way. From the French position, from Napoleon's vantage point, this looked like the culminating moment that all the suffering of the day had been building toward. The Guard going in when the enemy was weakened, the cavalry ready to pour through the gap onto the battle won before full darkness fell. What the Guard did not know, what no soldier advancing through battle smoke at 7 in the evening after 12 hours of combat could have known, was what waited on the other side of the crest. Wellington had held General David Chassey's 3rd Netherlands Division in reserve through the entire battle, committed to nothing, positioned behind the ridge, invisible to French observers. Chassey's horse artillery battery under Captain Cromer de Beechin was unlimbered and ready. The British foot guards under Major General Peregrine Maitland were lying in the grass, invisible in the smoke, waiting for an order. The Guard crested the ridge and found a battlefield that had lied to them about how much it had left. Wellington's order was given. Captain Cromer de Beechin's horse artillery battery opened an unexpected, devastating, enfilading fire into the flank of the advancing French Guard. The angle was precise, the range was point blank, and the Guard, designed for frontal assault, had no prepared response to fire from an unexpected quarter. Then Colonel Detmer's 1st Brigade of Chassey's division, Dutch and Belgian infantry moving at what their orders specified as the storm pace, launched a bayonet charge into the wavering French columns from one side, while Maitland's foot guards rose from the grass on the other. Standard British and popular accounts of Waterloo, written in the years and decades after the battle, attributed the repulse of the Imperial Guard almost entirely to Maitland's British foot guards. The Dutch-Belgian contribution, Chassé's division, Nodetmer's brigade, Kramer de Bichin's artillery, was systematically minimized or omitted. The Italian historian Alessandro Barbero, in his comprehensive study of Waterloo drawing on French, British, Prussian, and Dutch-Belgian sources, identifies the specific mechanism by which this happened. Many of Detmer's men wore blue uniforms, and in the smoke and chaos of the engagement, some British units mistook them for French troops, with friendly fire incidents that became misidentifications in subsequent memoirs. Those memoirs shaped the narrative. The blue uniforms didn't make it into the British version of the story. Modern scholarship has corrected the record. The Guard retreated. The 4 words in French, La Garde recule, that nobody in the French army had ever heard spoken as a statement of fact, spread from the ridge into the valley, from the valley into every French unit still capable of hearing them. The psychological effect cannot be overstated and does not require exaggeration. Every French soldier on that field had organized his understanding of the battle's probable outcome around a simple premise. The Guard does not retreat. When the Guard retreated, the premise on which French confidence had rested for 20 years collapsed simultaneously. Units that had not yet been broken began to break. Formations that had held all day dissolved. The Army of the North, which had been a functioning military organization at 7 o'clock, was ceasing to exist as a coherent force at 8 o'clock. The romantic French accounts that emerged in the years after Waterloo speak of the old Guard forming a final square, refusing surrender, on a fighting to the last man, immortalized by General Cambronne's alleged expletive or his defiant declaration that the Guard dies, it does not surrender. Analysis of French roll call records tells a different story. Official returns show units where over 400 guardsmen were captured, compared to only a handful killed. Cambronne himself was captured, not killed in a heroic last stand. The Guard died in some places, and surrendered in others, and fled in others, as armies do when they are broken. The legend required it to have died everywhere, uniformly. The records are less convenient. Wellington rode to the crest of the ridge, stood in his stirrups, and waved his hat forward. The signal for a general advance of the entire Anglo-Allied line. Simultaneously, Prussian forces under Gneisenau erupted from Plancenoit onto the main highway, severing the French line of retreat. The Army of the North, which had crossed into Belgium 6 days earlier as the finest force France had ever assembled, became a panicked mob in the space of 40 minutes. What happened after 8 o'clock on the evening of the 18th of June was not battle. It was the accounting that follows when a military force stops being a military force. The French center, tens of thousands of infantry who had spent the day waiting for orders that never resolved into anything decisive, watched the Guard retreat and made the calculation that armies make when cavalry protection disappears and defeat becomes a certainty. They abandoned their positions. They threw away their weapons. They ran. The pursuit fell primarily to the Prussians, who had the horses and the energy that Wellington's infantry, and after 12 hours on that ridge, largely did not. Gneisenau conducted the chase as far as Frasnes, 11 miles from the battlefield, driving what had been Napoleon's army ahead of him through the June darkness. Napoleon himself did not stay with the rear guard. He fled the field on horseback, heading back toward Paris, abandoning his broken army, a decision his critics, both contemporary and historical, have never fully forgiven. At approximately 9:15 in the evening, Wellington and Blücher met in front of the inn of La Belle Alliance, the Beautiful Alliance, which was the name the Prussians used for the entire battle. They agreed that the Prussians, who had the strength for it, would continue the pursuit through the night. They shook hands. The two men who between them had prevented Napoleon from destroying European stability met by lamplight amid the dead and dying, with tens of thousands of men between their positions and the horizon. The cost had been staggering. Napoleon's army lost approximately 25,000 killed and wounded on the field, with 9,000 more captured and approximately 15,000 additional men who deserted in the days following, as the Army of the North dissolved entirely rather than retreating. Wellington's Anglo-Allied force suffered approximately 15,000 casualties, 3,500 killed, 10,200 wounded, 3,300 missing. The Prussians, who had fought at both Ligny 2 days before and at Plancenoit during the battle itself, had lost approximately 7,000 killed and wounded in the Waterloo engagement. An estimated 7,000 horses were killed or maimed in the fighting. Years of careful breeding, destroyed in hours. 6 French generals were killed during the battle, and 37 wounded, out of 114 present. The Allied forces lost 5 generals killed and 14 wounded. Wellington, who had been in the saddle since before dawn and had ridden from crisis to crisis for 12 hours, sat down that night to write his official dispatch. He wept. Multiple contemporaries recorded it. He had said before the campaign that nothing except a battle lost could be half so melancholy as a battle won. And he had meant it. His old friends were dead. His soldiers were dying on the field. He had won the battle he had prepared his entire career to fight, and he wept for it. The dispatch took all night. By 5 o'clock in the morning, it was still unfinished. He mounted his horse and rode to Brussels, where the city's bells were ringing. Dawn on the 19th of June revealed 3 square miles of what a battle actually costs when the accounting is made in bodies rather than positions. Sir Walter Scott, who visited the Waterloo battlefield in January of 1816, documented the physical evidence that remained months after the fighting. The smell, the traces, the disturbed ground. Contemporary witnesses in the immediate aftermath described a landscape that those who saw it struggled to render in language adequate to what they had seen. The archaeological reality of the Waterloo battlefield illuminates something about what happened to the dead in the weeks after the fighting. Excavations of the site have consistently found far fewer human remains than the casualty figures would predict. The explanation is documented. Bones were collected from the Waterloo battlefield in the months and years following the battle and sold for grinding into fertilizer. The men who died at Waterloo did not lie undisturbed in the Belgian earth. They were processed into the agricultural economy of the country whose future they had fought to determine. In 2012, during excavation work for a new parking lot at the Memorial 1815 site, archaeologists discovered a skeleton that was probably a Hanoverian soldier who died during the battle. And this particular man, who represents physically and individually the 50,000 statistics, is now displayed in the museum that stands on the ground where he died. He has no name. The records don't carry it. History preserved his bones and forgot everything else about him. The survivors of specific actions lived out the consequences of what had happened. Lord Uxbridge, Wellington's cavalry commander who had launched the Union Brigade charge in the morning, lost his leg to a French cannonball during the final advance. The exchange that followed became one of the most documented moments of the battle's close. Uxbridge's exclamation that he had lost his leg. Wellington's reply that, by God, so he had. Uxbridge was fitted with what became one of the first successful above-the-knee prosthetic limbs. His original leg was buried in the garden of a Waterloo house, where it became, for a period, a tourist attraction. Marshal Ney, who had commanded the French cavalry and infantry assaults throughout the battle, and whose decisions remain among the most debated in military history, was executed by firing squad on the 7th of December, 1815, charged with treason against the restored Bourbon monarchy. Major Georg Baring, who had held Haye Sainte with 400 men until 42 of them remained functional, survived and was eventually promoted to the rank of Major General Baron von Baring. The promotion and the title acknowledged what no immediate award at the time adequately recognized: that the defense of one farmhouse with Baker rifles and 60 rounds per man, because against everything the French could bring to bear over 6 hours, had been as consequential to the battle's outcome as any action taken by anyone that day. Napoleon reached Paris on the 21st of June. He had expected to find a government that would grant him emergency powers, authorize a levy en masse, and give him the political authority to raise a new army before the coalition forces marching on the French frontier could arrive. What he found instead was Joseph Fouché, his own Minister of Police, a survivor of every regime since the Revolution and a man whose allegiance to any principle had always been subordinate to his allegiance to his own continued relevance. Fouché had already begun negotiating with the coalition. He had already calculated that Napoleon was more useful as a bargaining position than as an emperor. From the provisional government, which Fouché effectively controlled, recognized that coalition armies were advancing on Paris and that Napoleon's political capital had been entirely exhausted. They demanded his abdication. On the 22nd of June, 4 days after the battle he had just lost, Napoleon signed his second abdication, formally, nominally, in favor of his infant son, whom he designated Napoleon II. The child was immediately deposed by the provisional government, which had no interest in continuing any Napoleonic succession and was focused entirely on achieving a peace settlement before the coalition's armies arrived. Napoleon traveled to Rochefort on the Atlantic coast, hoping to secure passage across the ocean to the United States. The British Royal Navy maintained a comprehensive blockade on, according to Napoleon's own account, later given at St. Helena. His brother Joseph proposed that he escape aboard a Danish cargo ship concealed in a wine vat, a plan Napoleon rejected, as he said, out of concern for the historical ridicule if he were captured in such circumstances. On the 13th of July, recognizing that Fouché intended to hand him to the Royalists if he remained in France, Napoleon drafted a formal letter requesting political asylum from the British Prince Regent, asking to be allowed to reside in England under the protection of British law. On the 15th of July, he boarded HMS Bellerophon, a Royal Navy ship of the line, and formally surrendered himself to Captain Frederick Lewis Maitland. The British government had no intention of allowing Napoleon to remain anywhere in Europe. On the 7th of August, HMS Bellerophon received orders to proceed to Plymouth. Napoleon was transferred to HMS Northumberland on the 9th of August and sailed for St. Helena, a remote, heavily fortified island in the South Atlantic, chosen specifically for its remoteness and the difficulty it presented to any rescue attempt. He lived there in guarded captivity for the remaining 6 years of his life, dictating his memoirs, constructing the version of his career he wanted history to accept, and dying on the 5th of May, 1821. His personal physician's autopsy confirmed stomach cancer as the cause of death. The Treaty of Paris, signed on the 20th of November, 1815, formally concluded 23 years of recurrent European warfare. The framework established by the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, with its balance of power maintained by great power consultation and mutual deterrence, created the diplomatic architecture that provided a century of relative stability. No general European war would disturb that architecture until the summer of 1914, 99 years after the mud dried at Mont Saint-Jean. Military academies study Waterloo not because muskets and infantry squares have any application to modern warfare, but because the battle contains, compressed into a single June afternoon, almost every lesson about how engagements are actually decided that remains relevant regardless of the weapons involved. The terrain lesson is Wellington's reverse slope, a tactical choice so counterintuitive that it required explaining to his own officers and confounded Napoleon's gunners entirely. Unstandard Napoleonic artillery doctrine assumed visible targets. Wellington denied Napoleon visible targets for most of the day, and the Grand Battery's bombardment, which should have destroyed the Allied center before d'Erlon's infantry reached it, spent most of its ammunition on empty grass. Every military commander since who has exploited concealment, reverse slopes, urban cover, or the psychological dimension of appearing weaker than you are, has replicated the principle, if not the specific tactic. The coordination lesson is Blücher's march from Wavre. Two armies from different nations, commanded by different generals with different doctrines and different languages, coordinating without real-time communication across 13 kilometers of Belgian mud to ensure that Prussian arrival at Waterloo was timed precisely enough to be decisive, rather than simply too late. This was not a happy accident. It was the direct result of a specific promise, kept by a 72-year-old man who had been knocked from his horse 2 days earlier and had reasons to argue that his army needed time to recover. He made no such argument. The coordination that followed, imperfect, delayed, grinding, but ultimately decisive, is what coalition warfare actually looks like when it works. The logistics lesson is la Haye Sainte. The most important tactical position on the battlefield fell not to French military genius or overwhelming force, but to an administrative oversight. No reserve ammunition pre-positioned for Baker rifles, no resupply mechanism established. A wagon overturned on a road before the fighting began. Wellington acknowledged the failure explicitly, which was not his habit. 400 men held for 6 hours and then fell because of a quartermaster's oversight that no one thought critical enough to double-check. The lesson that battles are often decided in the supply chain before the first shot fires is documented in this instance with painful clarity. The historiographical lesson is the Dutch-Belgian contribution to repulsing the Imperial Guard. For over a century, the standard English language account of Waterloo presented the victory as essentially a British achievement, with Blücher's Prussians playing an important but supporting role, and the other Allied nationalities appearing mainly as background. Modern scholarship, particularly Barbaro's comprehensive work drawing on sources across all participating nations, has restored a more accurate picture in which Chassé's Dutch-Belgian division and Detmer's brigade played a direct and decisive role in the moment that ended the battle. The mechanism by which this correction became necessary: blue uniforms misidentified in smoke. British memoirs shaping the dominant narrative, the political convenience of a simple national triumph, applies to how military history is constructed generally. Who tells the story decides what the story says. The battle that Waterloo most closely anticipates, in its combination of defensive preparation, Allied coordination, on logistical vulnerability, and psychological collapse at the decisive moment, is the engagement that Waterloo's peace prevented from happening for 99 years. When that peace finally broke in 1914, the armies that marched carried the institutional memory of Waterloo's lessons in their doctrine. Whether they had actually learned those lessons is a different question. The ground is green now, south of Waterloo. The farms are still there. Hougoumont, partially restored, its north gate still standing. La Haye Sainte, still privately owned, visible from the road. The Lion's Mound rises 43 meters above the ridge, built between 1823 and 1826, using 300,000 cubic meters of earth, taken from the ridge itself. Wellington complained when he saw it, or saying they had altered his field of battle, which they had. From the top, in good weather, you can see the entire ground over which the battle moved from 11:30 in the morning until 9:15 at night. The Waterloo soldier, the Hanoverian, whose skeleton was found in 2012 during parking lot excavation, is behind glass at the Memorial 1815 Museum. He has no name. The records of who specifically died in what specific place were not kept with sufficient precision to identify him. He was a man from Hanover who marched to a Belgian ridge and didn't come home. And history has preserved his bones without preserving anything else. Wellington said it was the nearest run thing he had ever seen. The phrase has been widely paraphrased as a damned close run thing. But Thomas Creevey, who recorded it the next morning when Wellington spoke to him from his Brussels hotel window, has it as the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Wellington said this while acknowledging that Blücher had lost 14,000 men at Ligny 2 days before, that he himself had not been able to find Blücher on the morning after Ligny, and that 30,000 men between them were dead or wounded. He said it with gravity rather than triumph. He was not celebrating. He was accounting. 4 things had to go wrong simultaneously for Wellington to win. The mud that degraded French artillery, the Prussians who kept their promise, the farmhouse that ran out of bullets and still held for 6 hours, and the guard that walked backward when every expectation of 20 years said they would not. Any one of those factors, resolved differently, might have changed the outcome. The mud might not have come. Blücher's promise might have been kept more slowly. La Haye Sainte might have had its ammunition wagon delivered intact. The guard might not have encountered Chassé's fresh division waiting invisibly at the crest. All 4 resolved on the same June evening, in the same Belgian valley, within the same 3 miles of saturated ground. And 99 years of European history followed. Waterloo doesn't tell us that the right side wins, or that preparation defeats improvisation, or that Allied coordination is always achievable. It tells us that history pivots on accumulated specifics, on a corporal forcing a gate shut, on an ammunition wagon overturned on a road, on a 72-year-old man deciding that a promise made after a defeat is still a promise, on a hill that made an army invisible until the moment it needed to be seen. Wellington said it was the nearest run thing he ever saw in his life. He was right. And the world that followed from that nearest run evening is, in its broad architecture, recognizably the one we inherited.